Thanks everyone for joining in to the 9th FSML seminar. So today we have Doruk Aksoy. He's going to be talking about from turbulent flows to video games, managing large-scale data with tensor decompositions. So Doruk Aksoy is a fifth-year Ph.D. candidate in Aerospace Engineering and Scientific Computing at the University of Michigan and a McD Fellow working under the supervision of Professor Alex Gardetsky. Prior to joining U of M, he studied mechanical engineering at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, Turkey. During his PhD, he worked on developing incremental tensor decomposition algorithms to accelerate scientific machine learning through data reduction. So with that, the floor is all yours, and thanks for accepting the invitation.
Thank you for the invitation, first of all. It's my pleasure to be talking at this seminar series. So today I will be talking about how we can handle the amount of data that we are generating nowadays, but let's put things into perspective a little bit. So as I said, we're generating a very large amount of data, irrespective of the scale of the problem that we're working with. So if we, on a celestial scale, we have the SKAO dataset, which is about the galaxy observations and satellite dishes, which generates roughly around 700 petabytes of data per year. And if you go down to the Earth scale, the global scale, we have the ERI5 climate dataset, which sits around 9 petabytes. And if you go all the way down to the molecular level, we have the protein database, which sits around 1 terabyte, and a quantum dataset, which is aimed to be used in quantum machine learning problems, which sits around 100 terabytes of dataset. So these datasets these data is not generated just to sit around. There's a purpose why we generate this data, and that's obviously for data-driven machine learning or data-driven learning of systems. And I might be preaching out the choir here a little bit, but why do we need that much data, and why do we need the data-driven modeling that comes with it? So the first and most obvious reason why we need such a thing is that, one, the model we have might be too expensive. The forward model to compute stuff might be too expensive. And in this case, we have the ECMWF IFS, which is an ensemble-based forward climate model that runs for more than an hour on a whopping number of 1,428 nodes. So it requires a supercomputer, a cluster. And this setting just generates a 15-hour forecast of weather that includes 150 states at 50 levels of altitude with an 18-kilometer of resolution, which is not actually enough for accurate disaster prevention and evacuation management, but still, as you can see, this is a very large, very expensive forward model to compute, and this runs twice a day, by the way. And it's not an alternative, but as a response to that, I might say, there are two different data-driven models, one generated by the ECMWF, the AIFS, and one generated by NVIDIA, the ForecastNet. Both runs on a lower resolution at a 30-kilometer resolution and performs estimation or predicts much lower number of states than the original IFS, but it's still a leap forward or like a step towards the solution that we want to have from a data-driven modeling perspective. And as you can see, the computational requirements that we have in both cases are minuscule when compared to the gigantic requirements that we have for the IFS. But there's also a hidden cost there, which is called the training, which requires clusters of GPUs for hours, days, if not for weeks or months. So we also have to consider that factor that in. And the other case where a data-driven model might be needed is that the case where we actually don't have the model, or the model is unknown. And in this case, we have the OpenAI's Minecraft VPT model, which is a visual pre-training model, similar to ChatGPT, but for video models, that is trained on 720 GPUs, state-of-the-art GPUs for 9 days, and to play Minecraft. And if I recall correctly, the last time I checked, they were not even able to get to the diamond pickaxe. So this provides a perspective on why we need the data-driven modeling, but also this also shows that learning with full-scale data is a costly endeavor to pursue. If you go back to the climate modeling case, the data set they are trying to train on is roughly about 9 petabytes. And what they were doing as a remedy is that they were using a subset of states for prediction. They are also running their simulations on a lower resolution of the Earth, of the globe, and then upsampling using super resolution techniques such as Fourier neural networks, AFNOs, SFNOs, and all that jazz. And they even mentioned that in their paper or in their blog posts that due to memory requirements, running the simulation on a 1 kilometer resolution, which is still less than the resolution we need for accurate prediction for disaster management, they require more than 1,000 nodes. And if you go on to the other hand, if you go to the Minecraft case, the data set includes roughly 70,000 hours of gameplay at 20 FPS, and the original gameplay frames are at 360p. And what they state in their paper is that they had to downscale the frames to 128 by 128, and the limit comes actually from the fact that that is the smallest size that they were able to go without compromising the details in the GUI, which has a lot of effect in the gameplay. So I think that it's evident that we need to learn a reduced representation. And that reduced representation ideally has to contain or maintain the maximum amount of information from the full data. And if we can provide a good guarantee on the approximation error of the full data set, then it would be perfect. Okay, then the next question, a natural question would be, how can we learn such a reduced representation? Let's split the board into 4. And I know this is not an extensive lit review on the dimensional introduction method, but just to provide a perspective on what do we have. On one corner, we have our good old friends, linear projection methods, PCA, SVD, the randomized versions, which preserve the global variance quite well. And they also do have a direct out-of-sample projection method, which means that we can map an unseen data point onto the learned low representation. But if you have a data set that is highly nonlinear, or if the data that you're playing with is coming from a multidimensional structure, such as a 3-dimensional simulation of a volume, then you will be struggling with the representation accuracy, especially for generalization cases. On the other hand, we have nonlinear manifold methods, the TSNE, UMaps. They are very good at capturing nonlinear structures. They generate amazing visualizations with good clustering. But as far as I know, they don't have any direct out-of-sample extension, so there's no way to directly map the unseen data onto the learned manifold. Obviously, we do also have the neural network-based methods, which are highly expressive, very nonlinear. But if you remember the amount of GPUs OpenAI had to use to train the model, they require significant hyperparameter tuning, and also, especially with the amount of data that we currently have or we are talking about, you need clusters of GPUs to be able to handle that much data. And finally, and obviously, we do have the tensor decomposition methods, which are an expressive multilinear representation method, which also enables a manual trade-off between the approximation error and the size of the approximation, and also which is very easy to train, which is very easy to learn using widely known linear algebra operations, linear algebra packages. But the only drawback there is that the tensor decompositions are a little bit sensitive to reshaping of the tensor. So how this tensor is structured, or how you're reshaping your tensor, or how you're tensorizing your data. But obviously, today I'll be mainly talking about the tensor decomposition-based methods. So I know most of you people are not very familiar with tensor decomposition and tensor decomposition formats. So let me do a very brief explanation on what tools do we have. So on one hand, let's first start with the tensor representation. So this little dot with, or node with spikes you see is a four-dimensional tensor. So every node is a linear algebra object, and the number of spikes going out of that node determines the number of dimensions for that specific linear algebra object. So in this case, the object is a four-dimensional tensor. And we have the Tucker format that approximates a four-dimensional tensor as four-factor matrices and a smaller core tensor. You can think of this as a higher order analog of the SVD on a very high level. But the problem with Tucker is that you still have the exponential relationship between the number of dimensions and the memory, even though the exponent of dimensions is on the rank side. It can get out of hand quickly if you're dealing with data of very large dimensions. And on the other hand, we have the CP decomposition, which represents or approximates a four-dimensional tensor in this case as a outer product, rank R outer product of rank R outer product of four vectors. And this, the drawback of CP decomposition is that you need to have a good guess of the rank, tensor rank R, which is actually finding the tensor rank R is an NP-hard problem. So you need to be either very lucky with how you're approximating the tensor rank R, or you have to be over-approximating to be on the safer side. And finally, we have the TT format or the tensor train format, which approximates a four-dimensional tensor as a product of four three-dimensional tensors. And this is a very practical way of approximating the data. It doesn't suffer from the exponential memory requirements of the Tucker format. And you can also come up with algorithms that perform the approximation procedure with guaranteed relative error thresholds. So we will be proceeding with tensor train for the time being. And let me briefly go over the details of the tensor train format. So each of the three-dimensional tensors, three-dimensional linear algebra objects that construct the tensor train format are called TT cores, and the dimensions that are connecting each subsequent node are called TT ranks. And one other good benefit of using tensor train format is that you are able to reconstruct, or you are able to recover individual entries or slices of the original tensor without reconstructing the entire tensor, which would be very useful, especially if let's say you want to analyze a slice of the volume, but the volume is coming from a very large terabyte sized data set. You can only get one slice of the original tensor without you needing to reconstruct everything, and then perform an analysis and be done with it. There are a couple ways to compute an approximation in the tensor train format. Probably the most widely known one being the TT-SVD algorithm, which is a SVD-based algorithm and a one-shot algorithm. And since we are dealing with very large-scale data, we are not able to perform one-shot decomposition. So we need to resort to incremental algorithms or streaming algorithms. Some of the streaming algorithms don't provide any approximation guarantees for the entire stream. Some incremental algorithms do not provide or do not exploit actually the properties of the TT format to the fullest. So the TT-ICE algorithm is the state-of-the-art incremental tensor train decomposition algorithm that provides both approximation guarantees for the entire stream, even for infinite streams, and also provides an adaptive and bounded rank growth on the TT ranks. So what does TT-ICE do? The name comes from tensor train incremental core expansion, and as the name suggests, the TT-ICE algorithm builds up on an existing set of TT cores. May they be trained using a TT-SVD algorithm or using a previous step of TT-ICE, and given a tensor stream, the TT-ICE algorithm updates the TT cores with new basis vectors and new slices of new orthogonal slices, so that only the necessary and missing information are added to the representation, and therefore maintains that bounded range growth. And another added benefit of using the TTI's algorithm is that since we are accumulating the tensor stream on an additional axis, the first n-1 TT cores will be same for the whole data set, and you're actually getting a unique slice of the last TT core for each individual tensor. And if you recall from the previous slide, since we are able to reconstruct slices of the original tensor, this allows us to use the slices of the last TT core as latent representations of the compressed data as well. Okay, enough technicality, enough details. So how does it perform on data? That would be something that you are curious. And here we have a data set of simulating Hall thruster simulations. Hall thrusters are an electropropulsion method that is used on satellites. They have very cool images, as you can see on the lower left corner. But the higher level idea is that we have a three-dimensional volume that we're simulating with very fine time discretization steps, and we are discretizing the three-dimensional volume by cubes of 10 centimeters. So we have like 120 by 100 by 100 grid, and we have multiple states at each grid point. And one good thing about let me go first over the details. So, and each snapshot of the simulation takes around 330 megabytes. So given that we are simulating it on a 10 to the minus 6 seconds scale, saving every time snapshot would be too expensive. As a remedy, people have been using temporal downsampling and saving every 50 time steps. That provides a trade-off between maintaining the overall behavior of the system, but not exploding the memory requirements to just even store the data. And we're just compressing the steady state portion to avoid any like transient effects in the data set. But this is very important. So even though the data is inherently three-dimensional, what we can actually do is we can artificially increase the dimensionality of the data, but simply reshaping. If you're using MATLAB, it's like MATLAB reshape, NumPy reshape, very simple reshaping, no extra tricks. This allows us to increase the dimensionality of the system and therefore make it more suitable for tensor decompositions. Okay, enough talk. Now how it performs on the data. So let's set the scene a little bit. So we are compressing the data set. We are compressing neutral number densities with 1% target relative error. We are performing a square root normalization just to bring the scales of the numbers to a more comparable level. And the full snapshot that we were compressing here, the collection of snapshots that we were compressing here was 5.5 gigabytes. And after performing the compression at 1% target error, we are compressing the size on disk all the way down to 680 megabytes. So roughly, I would say 10 times compression, 8 times compression. And everything is done actually in 135 seconds, so just a little over 2 minutes. And as you can see, after compressing this much data, we end up with a latent space size of 34. So this entire large scale simulation can be represented with just 34 entries on a vector. And you may be wondering, how does it look like after compression? This is it. So on the left-hand side, we have the original snapshot of the field variables on the number densities. And on the right-hand side, we have the reconstructed version of it. And if you just look very closely, there are just very minor artifacts on the edge of the plume of the electrospray thruster. So we are preserving almost everything without sacrificing anything. And another added benefit of performing compression with incremental tensor decompositions is that if your data is not changing much, you don't necessarily have to know. If there's a structure in your data set that you're presenting to the compression algorithm, the tensor the incremental TT or TTIs will discover it and exploit it to the fullest. So here we have 10% target relative error with z-score normalization. We have a full snapshot size of 4.2 gigabytes, and the compressed size is just 35 kilobytes. Everything that is done within 15 seconds, and we actually end up with a latent space of size 1. So just one number can tell everything. And actually it happens because the electric fields are actually not time varying. So even though when I was compressing the data, I wasn't familiar with the simulation environment at all. So I was just receiving the data and compressing. And it was able to discover this on its own and then exploit it and achieve extreme levels of compression. So, okay, everything up until here was more on the compression for the sake of compression, reducing storage time. And I promised to show some video games to you. So let's move on with those. In this project, in this case, we have episodes of Atari gameplays with color images of size 210 by 160, which roughly translates to 101,000 pixels. And similar to the electrospray thruster case, we are increasing the dimensionality of the dataset artificially by reshaping and accumulating along the last dimension. And at the end of the day, it's this crowded table shows that depending on the relative error threshold you determine, the TT-ICE algorithm automatically determines what the corresponding latent size will be and how complex the representations will become. And if we just focus on the 1% case here, we are seeing anywhere between 3.5x all the way up to 78 times compression, because Pong is this game for the ones who are not familiar with the game Pong. If the game is simple, the approximation will be simple. That's the whole story. And you might be wondering, okay, we have seen a lot of numbers now. What does that correspond to? And if we just look at the original images on the top row and the reconstructions at 1% relative error level, you can see that there are actually almost no visual artifacts. If you look very, very closely, there are some things here at the Pong game, but overall, you are not sacrificing any visual quality while performing all the way up to 80 times compression. But this case was not for compression for the sake of compression. We had another objective in mind, which was performing behavioral cloning using the latent space that we learned. And in that case, the competitors to extracting that latent space information was obviously autoencoders and variational autoencoders, obviously the convolutional versions of those. And the task was simple: extract the latent space information, use the latent space representations, and try to predict the actions the expert player would have taken in that scenario. And if you look at the reconstructions of gameplay frames specifically for Miss Pac-Man, we can see that the autoencoder is doing partially a good job. I know it would be hard for you to see, especially if you're far from the screen, but if you look at the variational autoencoder, you can see that it's just struggling a lot. And TensorTrain, the reconstructions with TTIs are just like same as the original image. And okay, now we see that we are guaranteeing good reconstructions with TTIs. How does that translate to end-to-end training time? So the figure on the lower left corner shows the relative training time with respect to training the entire architecture with full frames. So the AE, VAE are obvious, they're all trained on GPUs. The TT-CPU is the version of TensorTrain TTIs that is just using CPU to train the mapping, and the TT-GPU uses GPU cores to learn the mapping. And you can see, let's start with Miss Pac-Man with mid-sized latent spaces. We are seeing almost even on CPU, we are observing a good amount of reduction in end-to-end training time. And if you actually move to smaller latent space sizes where...
I think there's a question.
Oh, is there a question, Mohammed?
Yeah, I think I don't know if the question could wait. I think super cool visuals. One thing I'm thinking, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, super cool visuals. One thing I'm thinking of here, I'm not super familiar with it, but for example, in the successive deep learning, they say like the ImageNet dataset, which is this data set of images of like cats and dogs. Usually there's like this low manifold hypothesis that the reason neural networks are doing super good is because this data is living on this lower manifold. So I'm wondering if like this framework could be used to detect this huge compression ratio of this huge ImageNet dataset.
But what we
What
are
do you
doing
think
is
on that?
actually, what we are doing here is actually exactly discovering that lower dimensional manifold, not with deep neural network based architectures, but with a tensor decomposition. So we are extracting that latent space information that lives on a much lower dimensional manifold than the original frames, and then using that representations in the downstream part.
I see. I think that's a super cool metric. Like you give me a data set, I would apply this tensor train decomposition, and then maybe the compression ratio is a metric of like how low dimensional the data set is, right?
Yeah, we actually, as a part of this study, we also did the following. We trained the tensor train, got the latent space sizes, as you see, and then we set the bottleneck dimension of the autoencoder and variational autoencoder to the same size. And we actually observed that we are not losing anything on the accuracy of the predictions. In some cases, we are actually surpassing the accuracy of the autoencoders and variational autoencoders, which is essentially explained in the reconstruction capabilities of the autoencoders and variational autoencoders.
Super cool. Thank you.
Okay. And where we are, yeah, if you go to the like Space Invaders, a more complicated game inherently, we see that the timings on CPU are getting almost tied with autoencoders, but as soon as you move everything on GPU to a level playing field, the tensor train decomposition based method is just blowing everything out of the water. And this is just like, we're talking about including all the data sets, including all the games we have used in that paper, we are seeing roughly around 30% reduction in end-to-end training time on CPU. And if you move everything onto GPU, we're talking about time reductions around 70%. Enough games, back to a little bit more science, because currently everything looks like it's almost too good to be true, right? Now, in the case of turbulence simulations, a more complex physics, a simulation with very complex physics, we have a three-dimensional Navier-Stokes simulations with turbulent initial conditions on a 64 by 64 by 64 grid. We have like 66 gigabytes of total data size, and we increase the dimensionality by artificially reshaping it to higher dimensions. So on the left-hand side, we see the compression ratio. We are achieving somewhere around 3 to 12 times compression on the training set. But if you check the generalization error, so the error relative error on the test set of the approximation, we see that the TT struggles to generalize to unseen data. So it shows that there are limits as to where we can apply this decomposition to. But there's also a solution to that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking. So the solution is that by introducing a hierarchy between dimensions and creating a hierarchical dimensions between dimensions, we are able to get better approximations. And how are we doing that? If we recall the Tucker and its n-dimensional core in the center, we are reshaping and performing further Tucker decompositions on the core, and we get a hierarchical representation, which is called the hierarchical Tucker format. However, this is parallelizable, and this gets rid of the exponential relationship of on the dimensions to a linear relationship, with a cubic relationship in ranks, and ranks are much lower than the size of the dimensions, so it's fine. But there's a catch: the hierarchical Tucker format, as is not suitable for incremental updates. So there's a little modification that we came up with, which is called the batch hierarchical Tucker format. And in that case, we had the idea in mind that, okay, if we have a stream of tensors, ideally they would be from the same or a very similar source. And they would share some structure across individual tensors within the stream. So there must be a way for us to exploit that repetition of structure in the tensor, in the stream. And then we came up with the batch hierarchical Tucker format, and we also showed that in our new preprint, we showed that the batch hierarchical Tucker format is actually better for streams of tensors than hierarchical Tucker format, both in terms of compression time and also in terms of compression ratio. A quick reminder of what we had, what we talk and what we have now is that previously up until this point I was talking about the tensor chain format, and now we are moving on to the batch hierarchical Tucker format, which is a three-type tensor decomposition format that allows or introduces a hierarchy between dimensions of the data. And obviously there is also a incremental version of it, which is called the Ph.D. rise, standing for hierarchical Tucker rapid incremental subspace expansion, which has a very similar idea of we have an existing, batch hierarchical Tucker representation, we present it with new data, and we update the representation accordingly. And similar to the TT ice case, we have a clear-cut distinction between the latent space representation or lower dimensional representation of the data and the shared tensor network structure that we can use to project or map any unseen data onto this lower dimensional manifold. The main difference between this and TT is that in TT we had a vector latent space. Here we have a two-dimensional latent space, which is essentially a matrix latent space. That's the only difference. And the most important thing is that, to the best of our knowledge, HC-Rise is the first algorithm in the literature that performs incremental updates on a hierarchical Tucker format. So that's pretty cool. Back to the turbulence case where it all started. So we had the TT, good compression, okay compression, horrible generalization. As soon as we introduce the hierarchical Tucker format, we actually see that we are achieving much higher compression and much better generalization error, even with as low as a handful of examples of snapshots or simulations in the dataset. So, okay, what does this mean? Let's check the energy spectrum of the turbulence. On the left-hand side, we have the training dataset, and the orange one is the original turbulence spectrum, the light blue is the tensor train, and the purple one down here is the hierarchical Tucker. It may look like the hierarchical Tucker one performs poorer with higher wave numbers on the training set, but as soon as you move on to the validation set or the test set that the algorithms haven't seen during the training part, we see that the hierarchical Tucker based dimensionality reduction actually maintains the structure of the data better than the tensor train counterpart. And while doing that, it is also achieving twice the compression than the tensor train based format. Good. I talked about Minecraft, so here's some Minecraft. So just a quick refresher on what the Minecraft dataset was. As I said, it's 70,000 hours of gameplay at 20 FPS on a 360p frame. We are also downsizing, similar to OpenAI, we are downsizing everything down to 128 by 128, because if they're allowed to do it, why shouldn't we? And we have roughly 20,000 gameplay episodes for 4 distinct tasks. But here we were just focusing on one task where the agent was supposed to find a cave, enter it, and terminate the gameplay. That was the task that the agent got. And on the right-hand side, you see the reduction ratio, the compression ratio of the latent space representation with respect to the training batches. And training batches consists of a second worth of frames. So like each batch has 20 frames. And as you can see, it looks like the solid lines are hierarchical Tucker and the dashed lines are TTIs, by the way. And from the looks of it, it looks like the hierarchical Tucker also struggles at higher approximation accuracy. And TTIs looks to be performing better. But if we are going over to the qualitative comparison, we actually have an interesting observation. So the videos will play, it just stays there for a while, but it will run. And so on the left-hand side, we have the 30% relative error compressions. On the right-hand side, we have 10% relative error compressions. In the center, we have the original video downsized to 128 by 128. Bottom row is hierarchical Tucker, top row is the tensor train. And it may not be very clear from the screen, but essentially, if you look at the 10% hierarchical Tucker compression, it's much better than the 10% TT compression, and it's actually very close to the original frames, even while achieving 2 times compression, which is impressive. But if you were to compare two methods, a fairer comparison would be between the TT at 10% and hierarchical Tucker at 30%, and that is actually explained by hierarchical Tucker, since it's providing or presenting a hierarchy between dimensions. The structure is better preserved with a hierarchical Tucker compression, and therefore the hierarchical Tucker achieves better qualitative reconstructions than the tensor train, even at higher relative error compressions. And we also have tried training a behavioral cloning pipeline, a very preliminary one you will see, with the hierarchical Tucker embeddings, and we actually have shown that they are also useful, similar to the TT-ICE embeddings. So let's watch the video for a bit, but let me actually move it a little bit further, because the agent moves, the untrained agent is just doing random stuff, the trained agent moves, walks, and actually it discovers the cave, but it was a little bit too eager, and it just dies. So we call it, finds the cave but fails at entry. And what can be the next steps for tensor decomposition-based dimensionality reduction? So what you can perform is that you can perform Bayesian inference. So actually, the GIF that you see on the lower right, this is a GIF of a optimal sensor placement experiment routine that I have done using tensor train embeddings. You can also create generative models. You can learn world models, which is a project that you're currently working on. The left one is using hierarchical Tucker embeddings. The left one is using hierarchical Tucker embeddings. The right one is using tensor train embeddings in different architectures, one diffusion, one RNN-based models. You can build surrogate models, which is also another thrust that we have in our research group, to build lower dimensional approximate models using tensor network embeddings. And there are also a couple other potential extensions where we can go for processing streams with multiple fidelities, with different fidelities optimally, or performing decentralized compression using federated compression methods, algorithms, to learn an individualized compression at each node of a supercomputer, and therefore also accelerate the compression process with even larger scale data. And after all, what to remember for today? Compress, don't stress. This was one of the title suggestions that I got from, I think, Perplexity when I was looking for some inspiration, and I didn't want it to go to waste. But if we are being serious, we can achieve extreme compressions using tensor decompositions, incremental tensor decompositions. We can learn useful reduced spaces with TT-ICE and HD-RISE. And if you are coming to SciMCAC next week at Texas Fort Worth, please stop by at the following mini symposia. If you like this and you want to learn more about these mini symposia are on either tensor decompositions or tensor methods on computational science and engineering. And obviously, some of the references, some of the papers, work that I have been mentioning throughout the lecture. I would like to thank two sets of people. One, the set of people that made this research possible by providing the funding, and two, the set of people that made this research possible by providing the necessary brains for it. And I would be happy to take any questions.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to open the floor for any questions, like either in the room or online. People online can just unmute themselves or like type anything in the chat. But yeah.
Just very few high-level questions. First of all, at least for some of the data sets that you showed, like I imagine for the climate data especially, those sort of trends probably change significantly over time if you are considering data over maybe 50-year timescales or so. How expensive is it in general to maybe update your representation as the new data comes in for these sort of data sets?
That is a very good question, and that's actually one of the central questions that the climate modeling people have been dealing with, especially with the current with climate change that we have. So there are two things that we can perform there. One, we can blindly go and update our model with new data coming in. So you can always resume learning a new representation without compromising the previous representations at all.
Okay.
So if you adapt your tensor network mapping with new climate snapshots, you can do that without changing anything about the past.
Okay.
But then you might run into the risk of creating a very large representation, especially if the new trends in the weather are very far off from the previous trends. But for that, people have been employing forgetting factors in their compression algorithms. That would obviously violate the guarantees for the entire duration of the stream.
Okay.
But if you want to tailor your representation to the most recent, say like 30 years, 40 years, you can also employ these forgetting factor based modifications.
Interesting. And the second one is just like a clarification question. So on slide 24, you were showing some reconstructions with all of the different dimensionality reduction methods. So yeah, so just curious, are you reconstructing these with the numbers, or have the numbers like added in later and they just represent the gameplay with the agent? Because I imagine you don't want to reconstruct the images with the numbers, right?
You're talking about these numbers? No, they are included in the frame.
Oh, but what purpose would the numbers serve? Why can't they just be like a separate feature that you...
That is a very good question. What we could do is we could have separated the frame from down, one being like a part being the gameplay frame, and the second part is the more the informational or the GUI part. But we didn't want to perform this, and because to be honest, people haven't done it.
Oh, okay.
People were mostly using grayscale, like they were converting the RGB frames into grayscale and learning stuff there, like using the RGB frames. And then we said, okay, like if we were to compare us with the literature, let's do what they have done, but in RGB.
Understood.
But yeah, we are also creating the numbers, like everything is embedded together. But that's the beauty of the tensor network based or tensor decomposition based dimensional reduction. It can discover on its own that these two are separate and this part is not changing much.
I see.
So it's happening like autonomously per se.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, nice talk and really good visuals. And so in one of the questions which I had is, in some of your test cases, you broke down the dimension into like subparts to increase the dimensionality of the total input, right? So I'm just curious if you have any heuristics based on which you do that. Like additional question related to that is, if you have in some of your gameplays, you can go back, I guess. Sorry, I don't remember the slide number. Yeah, this one will be good. So in this case, let's say if you see the rightmost one where there are like lines, horizontal lines. Yeah, so my question would be like, if you are going to break it along horizontally, then would that increase the rank of your decomposition as compared to having it in a full?
Let's start with the first question, the heuristics about how to choose a reshaping. So especially for tensor train case, the idea is that if if you have too large dimensions, then you are not providing you will be allowing to the TT ranks to grow larger, easier, and by reducing the size of each dimension to my personal experience is to reshape it to sizes of roughly around tens, like 10, 15, 20, that order of magnitude.
Okay.
Provides a very good balance between the number of dimensions versus the rank growth of the TT representation. And because if you factor it out to all its prime factors, then you would have multiple. You have to perform SVD multiple times in sequence.
Sure.
That would increase the computation time because TT is not, at least the TTIs, the current implementation is not parallelized.
Okay.
So that there is a trade-off between the number of dimensions and the approximation quality and the time, computation time. So it's and that's also a part of the drawbacks of using tensor decomposition-based methods. It's sensitive to those reshapings. So that's the practitioner's touch. But since it's very easy to train those, you can play around with them easily.
Sure.
You can see for yourself better.
And sorry, one more question. So speaking of time, did it also increase the reconstruction time based on if you have to break it down?
The reconstruction time?
Right.
So that actually depends on the projection of unseen frames is just projecting each dimension onto individual TT cores sequentially. So the projection and reconstruction are both sequential procedures. So yes, if you are going to increase the number of dimensions too much, that would also slow down.
Okay.
But that slowdown might not be too much because you're only performing matrix multiply operations.
Sure.
So it's like considerably cheaper, but still it will take.
Oh, so the cost doesn't increase the dimensionality?
It does, but not so much.
I see. Okay, cool.
If you're just like projecting new frames onto the latent space or reconstructing from the latent space. But if you are doing updates, yes, because you will be increasing the number of dimensions and number of subsequent SVDs that you need to perform.
Sounds good. So so then the question, like, let's say if you have like horizontal strips in your data,
like in this case and this case.
Yeah. So now, if let's say if you have to do a tensor decomposition of the global matrix without dimensional increase, then I'm assuming you can find these ranks naturally. But let's say if it's broken down, then will it still lead to the same compression with the same number of ranks, or would you observe an increase in?
No, it would actually result like each different reshaping results in a different set of ranks.
Oh, I see.
So that was actually the part where it's sensitive to TT ranks.
Oh, okay.
In our latest preprint, we actually also have investigated how it influences the compression performance, especially both in terms of time and compression level.
I see.
And we have seen that it changes drastically depending on how you choose the dimensions.
Oh, okay, cool.
But for tensor train, roughly around 10s looks like to be a very sweet spot.
Okay. So I'm sorry, but if you have sizes of 10, what is the approximate ranks do you get? Like 3, 4?
So the ranks are not like, especially if you go down the line, it's not just, it doesn't only depend on the existing, like just on that particular dimension,
right,
but it also depends on all the other dimensions that come before it.
I see. Okay.
So it is an accumulation of ranks. So it has this sort of like a football shape, the like ellipse-ish shape where it grows and gets lower as you progress through the dimensions. But those are very interesting questions that goes deeper in the theory of the tensor formats. Those are very great questions.
Thank you. But if you can just add, so I'm also actually using Tucker Tensor for some of my work. I'm actually looking into some better algorithms to do.
We can definitely chat.
Yeah, that's why I actually came today. But yeah, thanks.
We can definitely chat. I'll be glad to do that.
Sure.
Any other questions? So I have one for the incremental one. Like, are you doing like rank 1 updates for updating your like tensor cores for the TTIs?
No, it's so the rank of the updates are determined depending on how much the end user desires to, like what level of accuracy the end user desires, and how different the provided like new data is from the past stream. So if rank 1 update is needed, there will be a rank 1 update on one core. That TT rank will grow 1, or that hierarchical Tucker rank will grow 1. But if more are needed, it will adaptively tune the amount of new basis vectors or new slices that will be added to each core.
Right. So
each
for the
tensor core.
turbulence problem, did you notice like it struggled with the number of ranks or like bases you're providing? Because like if the problem becomes more stiff or like there's a strong addiction term, like there'd be like more ranks required, right? Did you notice something like that?
To be honest with you, I don't remember the exact ranks of the turbulence problem, but we can investigate, like we can check those. I have them saved somewhere else. But especially speaking from if you just check the compression ratios or compression levels, here I'm assuming that we are increasing the earlier ranks more, but then it's not still enough to capture the multi-scale features of the turbulence, which is actually the hierarchical Tucker is there for.
Yeah, because like people use adaptive SVDs and stuff, but like as soon as there's like a strong advection terms, they struggle with the updates, and the number of like small number of bases, like it's just insufficient. So
maybe the hierarchy or the
Yeah.
multi-resolution capabilities of the hierarchical
Yeah.
Tucker might be helpful with those.
yeah, and this is like completely non-intrusive, right? So you don't need the solver or anything at all.
I just need the data.
Okay.
And actually, the TT Ice is already out there on GitHub as a like open source Python package, and I'm currently working on beautifying the hierarchical Tucker package. It's also written in Python. It will be out hopefully soon.
Okay.
But yeah, like nothing is hard coded. Everything depends on the data that you provide and the relative area that you set as the end user. So quite flexible.
Very interesting. Thanks. Yeah. Are there any other questions like in the room or online?
I have maybe one additional question. So this TTS algorithms, you said it's written in Python, right?
Mm-hmm.
But is it easy to extend it to MPI parallelization in C++ or something?
That's a good question. That's one of the many passion projects that I had in the past. But TTIs might not be very good for parallelization because of how the algorithm flows.
Okay.
But the hierarchical Tucker definitely is much more suitable for parallelization, inherently because of the properties of the hierarchical Tucker format and how we are computing it. But so far, nothing is parallelized. And actually, I was performing the Atari experiments were done on a 8-year-old laptop, and the rest, like all the experiments that I have been showing you, were done on compute nodes with at max 64 gigabytes of memory. So I did everything with very constrained resources, and that's the goal for it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, let's just thank the speaker one more time.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, really interesting talk, and yeah, thank you so much. Right, see you guys in 2 weeks. Thanks.